The gospel lesson for this Transfiguration Sunday is in Matthew's Gospel, the 17th chapter, beginning at the first verse. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. And then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down from the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." Here ends the gospel lesson. Once upon a time, a man named Sundar became a convert to Christianity and decided to stay in India, his home, to be a missionary and bear witness to Jesus. One late afternoon, Sundar was traveling on foot high in the Himalaya mountains with a Buddhist monk as his companion. It was bitter cold, and the night was coming on. The monk warned that they were in danger of freezing to death if they did not reach the monastery before the darkness fell. It so happened that as they crossed over a narrow path above a steep cliff, they heard a cry for help. Deep down in the ravine, a man had fallen and he lay wounded. His leg was broken and he couldn't walk. So the monk warned Sundar, "Do not stop. God has brought this man to his fate. He must work it out by himself. That is the tradition. Let us hurry on before we perish." But Sundar replied, "It is my tradition now that God has brought me here to help my brother. I cannot abandon him." So the monks set off through the snow, which had started to fall heavily. Sundar climbed down to where the wounded man was. Since the man had a broken leg, Sundar took a blanket from his knapsack and made a sling out of it. He got the man into it and hoisted him onto his back, and then began the painful and arduous climb back up the path. After a long time drenched with perspiration, he finally got back on the path, struggling to make his way through an increasingly heavy falling snow. It was dark now, and he had all he could do to find the path. But he persevered, and although faint from fatigue and overheated from exertion, he finally saw the lights of the monastery. Then he nearly stumbled and fell, not from weakness. He stumbled over an object lying in the path. He bent down on one knee and brushed the snow from the body of the monk who had frozen to death within sight of the monastery. And there, kneeling on one knee in the snow, he said aloud to himself the scripture passage from Luke, "For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will save it." And he understood what Jesus meant, and he was glad that he had decided to lose his life for another. Years later, when Sundar had his own disciples, they asked him this question, "Master, what is life's most difficult task?" And Sundar replied, "To have no burden to carry." To have no burden to carry. The truth is, there are burdens, and then there are burdens. 2 kinds, I think, at least. There are the burdens that are thrust upon us, and then there are the burdens which we choose. There are those who would drop in a moment, the burdens that they carry. There, probably every one of us here sometimes says, if I could just get rid of this one burden in my life would be so much better. And then There are burdens we would never put down because they have helped to make us who we are. And we have learned a lot from some of those burdens. Living life well is learning the difference, I think, between those two kinds of burdens and adjusting our thoughts and attitudes about the burdens we bear. In the Sundar story, the storm is the Buddhist monk's burden. It came upon him without warning, and there isn't anything he can do about it. And he carries that burden and fights this burden on his body, trying to get to the monastery. And he has no choice, he thinks. For Sundar, the man with the broken leg, is his burden. He chooses to accept this burden. But this too was a dangerous burden, says his monk companion. However, that fear-filled warning was not the only voice Sundar could hear. Somehow Sundar also heard the voice of God, and he went to help his brother. There's a famous man named Henry Nouwen. Some of you have read some of his stuff. We've used some of his stuff in Bible study on Wednesday nights. Nouwen was a very wonderful Christian professor at Yale Divinity School. He was a Roman Catholic priest, wrote a lot of magnificent devotional stuff. And in one of his books, he describes Christian action and Christian life like this. It's grounded in the historic Christ event, which is understood as a definitive breach in the deterministic chain of human trial and error, and as a dramatic affirmation that there is light on the other side of darkness. Do we understand Jesus' life and all that is taught in the New Testament about Jesus as this breach in what we consider to be the normal flow of life? Isn't his approach so radically different that we don't see it anywhere else? In the midst of all the tragedies and the pain of life, it seems to be there is always part of the Jesus story that you could lay over that situation in life and see, hopefully, some light coming out of that darkness. Some possibility that other people have never thought of. And sometimes in our own lives, as close as we are to the problems and the miseries that we have, it takes someone else with this light to come and share it to us. So we think that, yes, we can make it through. It is possible to hope. Life does go on. Today's gospel lesson is a lesson that's so unusual for us to think about. It's completely out of our experience. Unless we think about it in terms of the symbols that come in this gospel lesson. Jesus as light, for instance. And the fact that here on this mountain we hear God's affirmation of Jesus' way of living, of Jesus' way of understanding life, of his teaching us to hope in God. That's what this mountaintop experience really is. It's God's affirmation of this way of life. You know how you feel when something that you're doing or something you're attempting or some idea you have is affirmed from outside yourself. And maybe it's affirmed only from God, but there have been times when you've made a plan and then everything seems to fall in place. Have you had that plan? Have you had that happen to you? And sometimes when it doesn't fall in place, it means I'm not supposed to do this. I don't think this is supposed to go this way. I'm getting all kinds of signs. And I've often talked to people, and as they're describing their life and whatever particular problem they came to me to talk about, I see all these signs coming, and they're saying, no, I don't think so. No, well, didn't this fall in place? Well, yeah, but, you know, it was kind of tricky. I wasn't sure about it. Well, about these people who came, well, you know, you can't trust people about these kinds of things. But didn't you really feel in your heart that this was something you would love? Yeah, but, you know, that's kind of emotional stuff. I don't know if I can really rely on that.